I'm going to go ahead and take a moment here to share my screen. If you have questions as we're going throughout the morning today, please feel free to plop those questions in the chat and I will address them as they come up. I think it's important that we unpack those questions as they come up just because we have the context. Sometimes if we wait until the end, the context is gone, the situation is gone. So please don't hesitate if you have questions or need anything, just to put those in the chat. If following this session you have questions regarding equity, please don't hesitate to reach out via email. My email address is on the screen. It will also be available for you at the end of the session as well. So we have three goals in our time together today. And the first is to build a common understanding of what equity is. I think it's really important that we build that collective understanding of what equity is and is not as we begin to have these conversations or continue to have these conversations and facilitate this complex work in our districts. So we want to walk away with that common understanding. Then begin to think about ways to plan and design for equity, not just in distance learning, but also in our traditional face-to-face settings. I know that this year has been an anomaly for so many districts. Some districts have gone back face-to-face, some districts are still remote, and some are a blend of the two. And so as we begin to think in the now, but also plan for the future, begin to plan and design for equity. And then finally, I want to leave you with some tools and resources to support equity in education and the work that you're all doing in your buildings. I also want to take some time to unpack the 4 agreements of courageous conversations. And this is applicable not just to the session that we're engaging in today, but in equity work in general. These 4 agreements come from Singleton and Linton's research around courageous conversations about race. And so the first is to stay engaged. It's really important that we stay as engaged as possible in this work, physically, emotionally, cognitively engaged in the work and in the conversations. The other part that ties into that is experiencing discomfort. I say that when we're doing equity work, it is not meant to be comfortable. When we're having these conversations, not just around race, but around gender, around sexual orientation, it's going to be uncomfortable, and that's okay. And that's part of the process. And marinate in that discomfort. For me, I find that when I am in that area of discomfort, that's when I'm experiencing that growth. So we know that we're going to experience that discomfort and be okay and be comfortable with being uncomfortable. The third part is to speak your truth. We have to be really honest with where we are in this process because so much of that work is that self-actualization, that self-realization, understanding where we are and speaking through that truth and being honest and not just saying what we think that others want to hear. And then finally, the fourth is to expect and accept non-closure. And I think in a 55-minute session, this is really important. We can't think of equity work as being just checking off a box. We can't think of equity work as being a simple framework that if we do A, B, C, and D in this order, then we're going to have these beautiful, equitable systems overnight. The reality is that this is complex, difficult work, and that at the end of a 55-minute session, at the end of one school year, we're not going to be at a place of full equity. And so it's okay and normal to have non-closure. So just know that you're probably going to walk away from many of these experiences having more questions than answers. And if we have that, then it means that you're probably doing the work well and that you're really digging in and exploring those conversations and topics around equity. I'm going to pause just to see if there are any questions before we get started. Okay. So Pennsylvania for the last couple of years has been engaging in some fantastic high quality work around equity and has really made equity at the forefront of their vision. And so this is Pennsylvania's definition of equity: every student having access to the educational resources and rigor they need at that moment in their education, regardless of their race, gender, ethnicity, language, disability, sexual orientation, family background, and/or family income. I want you to take a moment. I'll give you a second to read that over and just think about that. Okay. So let's talk about what equity is. And we're going to be looking at a framework a little bit later on that really emphasizes this need to understand the difference between equality and equity. So when we think about equity, it's thinking about everybody getting what they need at that moment without showing bias or favoritism. So I love this diagram, and I know that many of us have seen this before, but when we look at this image on the left, we see that this is equality. Everybody is getting the same thing. So everybody is getting access, getting that same podium. But in reality, it's not doing much to increase their access to that board. When we look at the image on the right, we see that this is a great example of what equity is. Everybody is getting what they need to have access to that board. So we see that the podiums are at different heights, or perhaps even we're getting some adaptive technology here so that everybody has access. This is where we want to move to, but I would argue that we even want to go a step further. And you might have seen this image out there, but there's sometimes a third image paired with this, and that's the idea of justice. And eventually the idea is to remove the barriers altogether. So in this instance, why not make the board bigger and make it come all the way down to the ground so that everybody has access? You might be familiar with that image of the baseball players and the tall fence. In that case, let's remove the fence, let's remove the barrier. So as we move our systems, we want to think about how can we shift our systems and our thinking from one of equality to equity and eventually around justice. This is a quote that comes from Governor Tom Wolf. It's rather lengthy, but I want to give you a moment to read over it because I think that this beautifully outlines his vision for equity in Pennsylvania schools. I'll give you a moment and then I'll tease out some of the pieces that I think are most relevant and probably the most powerful for myself. So when we think about our history of a commonwealth that is founded on tolerance, religious freedom, and justices, and his vision is to create environments, work with schools and communities to help settings where all students are made to feel welcome and valued, and promoting that culture of inclusiveness. Now, I know that over the last year, we've seen some leadership changes in Pennsylvania Department of Education, and Noe Ortega has articulated that he himself is devoted to continuing this vision of equity. And he says, diversity, equity, and inclusion remain priorities for PDE, and our Office of Safe Schools offers a collection of resources to ensure students have the opportunity to learn free from fear of harassment and discrimination. The complex discourse around equity is important to broaden perspectives and find feasible solutions to conflict to shape school communities for years to come. So know that this is work that is deeply ingrained in our state leadership and is being carried out in many of our districts across our Commonwealth. So now that we've had a chance to talk about what is equity and how does that relate to equitable schools, I want to ask you to take a moment to do some visualization. And I want you to close your eyes and envision, what do equitable schools look like, sound like, and feel like? And while you're doing that visualization, I'm going to share a link in the chat with you, or if you are accessing this on a mobile device, you can scan the QR code that's here. So in the chat, you should be seeing a link to a Menti. And this is going to ask you to add 3 words that describe what equitable schools sound like, look like, and feel like. So after doing that visualization, I'm going to invite you to add those words, and I'm going to project our answers on the screen. And that's going to give us a word cloud that populates all of our words and takes the words that are used most often and makes them large and in the center, and then those descriptors that are used less often and makes them smaller and around the perimeter. So what do equitable schools look like, sound like, and feel like? That link is posted in the chat one more time. For some reason, it came over a little strange there. I'm seeing words like safe, successful for all. Love the word rigorous and rigorous for all. High expectations, absolutely. We'll talk a little bit more about this later on, but as these are coming in, I keep seeing these ideas of rigorous and high expectations. I think that it is so important that we presume competence in all of our learners. When we start to presume incompetence and we hold our learners to lower expectations, we know how detrimental that is. Students then aren't engaged in their learning. They're not given access to that vital grade level content that we know is so important for their success. Student-centered, trauma-informed. Thank you for putting that in there. I think, I want to argue, and I'll talk about this a little bit later on, that COVID-19 probably hasn't created new inequities. I think that what it has done is that it has really put a light on the inequities that exist in our systems in general. And I think that as learners, and I keep saying return to normal, and I don't know what normal is going to look like, but as we return to more face-to-face instruction in the months to come, I think we have to be really centered around this idea of trauma-informed practices and the impact that COVID has had on learners. And we know the impact that stress has on the brain. So thank you for putting this in: access, supportive, motivated. Dignity, I love that. Diverse, inclusive, compassion, present, cultural respect. Wonderful. I'll give you another minute or so to continue adding. All right, thank you for doing that. So, what does equity look like, and what does equity mean in the age of COVID-19? To help us unpack this idea of equity and COVID-19, I want to turn to one of my favorite equity experts in the field, and his name is Paul Gorski. He is one of my favorites because he is doing the work. He is incredibly passionate, but he also is authentic, right? He doesn't want this feel good equity kind of work. He's not talking about checking a box, and he gives practical strategies and mindsets for educators to engage in to really better understand the inequities that exist within our system and feel prepared and confident in tackling those inequities. So I want to turn to this article written by Paul Gorski that talks about equity considerations during the time of COVID-19. As you're reading through this, I want to encourage you to think about this, not just in the context of COVID-19, but also beyond. And what are those equity considerations we need to be thinking about as we return to normal instruction? I'm going to share the link to the article with you in the chat. And when I do that, I'm going to ask you to take about 8 minutes to read through the article. As you're reading, I'd like you to select a line or phrase or a quote that resonates with you or you believe has deep implications for your work. And I'm going to ask you to hold on to that quote for our next piece of our reading protocol. So I'm going to go ahead and share the link with you in the chat. And why don't we again take about 8 minutes to read through that article. If your camera is on, feel free to mute your camera and mute your mic. I don't know about you, but I sometimes get really weird reading face when I'm trying to pay attention. So feel free to mute your camera, mute your mic. I will see you back here, let's say at 11:15. So we'll take 9 minutes, 11:15 for the next part of our protocol. As you begin to finish up, I'm going to invite you to share what I call your golden line in the Jamboard that I just shared with you in the chat. So if you check in the chat, you'll see that there is a link to a Jamboard, and Jamboard is just a virtual whiteboarding space. I'm going to ask you to grab a sticky note on the left-hand side. So you'll notice on the left-hand side of your jam, there's a little rectangle that says sticky note. If you grab a sticky note, you'll be able to copy and paste your golden line or the line or phrase that resonated with you the most and add it right to our Jamboard. So why don't we take a minute or so to finish up the article and then go ahead and add your golden line. After adding your golden line, I want to invite you to take a look at the stickies that were added. I love doing this because it gives us some insight into what resonated with the people that we're collaborating with today, but also helps us reach a deeper understanding of the importance or highlights of the piece of text that we're reading. Thank you for adding these. These are fantastic quotes. I noticed that somebody wrote in there about their camera and mic policies and talking about how they do not have a mic on or camera on policy. I can speak to this a little bit, and it was interesting. I have two boys who are in first and second grade, and up until a month ago, they were distance learning with me at home, and their teacher had a pretty strict camera on, mic on policy. And for my son, it was really hard for him to have that camera on. It was distracting. It took away from his learning. He was very self-conscious about seeing himself on camera. He's also a very fidgety kind of kid. So he's the kid that would roll around on the floor. He'd be paying attention, but he was always moving. And we had to have a conversation at the beginning of the year about how for him having that camera on was such a barrier to him learning. And thankfully we were flexible and able to make that work. But that's something that I've experienced as a parent. Yeah, I see this quote a couple of times. When we talk about this crisis only in terms of its newness, we fail to recognize the connection with generations of inequity and limits the equity impacts to our response or of our response. Absolutely. These issues that we're seeing are being exacerbated by COVID-19. I would argue that many of these issues are not new, issues of accessibility, issues of rigor, issues of those things that we're seeing coming to the forefront. It's just now we're being made aware of them and we're seeing the importance, that sense of urgency in addressing these inequities. I'm going to invite you, I see all of you sharing your quotes. I'm going to invite you, if there is something that connected with you or why or how you connected with that quote, I'm going to invite you either to grab the mic or in the chat, talk a little bit about why you selected that quote, if there's something else that you wanted to unpack with the group. And if not, that's okay also.
If you would like to speak, just please raise your hand and we'll unmute your mic.
Perfect, thank you. All right, so thank you for that. I'm going to go ahead and continue to share my screen because I want to talk about the what now and the what next and what does this begin to look like. So thank you for sharing your quotes.
You have somebody.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Nadine.
Hi, Tony. Sorry, I don't want to hold everything up, but when you ask us to say why we chose what we chose, I I did choose the not paying attention to just now, to thinking about it in the past, and I would say that was part of my aha moment with this, because I never saw myself as um, not wanting equity for people, not intentionally trying to do things that made other people feel any less than me or anybody else. But this period of time has really brought it home to me, the inequities in our system that I just never even thought about. And it was just a total, oh my gosh, I never even thought about that, and I really need to think about it. And so having that piece there makes it clear to me that it doesn't mean I'm a bad person. It just means I hadn't thought about those kinds of things because I lived the life I've lived, and it's, you have to just be aware of other people, and that's all.
Nadine, thank you for speaking your truth in this. And I think you're absolutely right. You know, we have to presume positive intent. We don't oftentimes intentionally do that. And that's that self-awareness piece that we're going to talk a little bit about in a little bit. And how do we pause and become aware of our limited perspectives or of our biases that we hold and our paradigms because of the experiences that we've lived. So thank you for speaking your truth. I appreciate that. Anything else? All right, wonderful. So let's I want to do just some quick visualization. We're not going to go back into our Menti, but we talked about now what equitable schools sound like, but what does equitable distance learning spaces look like, sound like, and feel like? How does this vision, so as you're doing that visualization, how does this compare to some of those words that we used earlier to describe our equitable spaces? And are there any additional words that you think need to be included in equitable distance learning spaces, or perhaps removed? And I'll invite you in the chat if there's anything, or you can just think about this, some silent reflection. So what do equitable distance learning spaces look like, sound like, and feel like? And how does that compare to the visualization of equitable systems that we talked about earlier? So what do we do about this? You know, this is, and when we go back to our norms from earlier, there is no one size fits all approach. We can't have one person in our system responsible for all of the equity work. If you are, by the way, an Ed Leadership subscriber, so if you are an ASCD subscriber and you get Ed Leadership, definitely take a look at this month's issue. They have a fantastic article in there about avoiding these pitfalls of equity work. And they identify 10 different pitfalls that we need to be aware of and careful not to fall into. And so, you know, part of it is kind of doing this work at a superficial level, kind of just checking it off. Part of it is putting one person in charge of all of that equity work. We all need to be engaging in and identifying and moving in that work in order to create those equitable systems. So what are some things that we can do? The first thing, and this comes from Dana Simmons, who is another one of my favorite equity experts in the field. She is fantastic, but she has put together kind of some resources to help support this equity work. And the first thing she says is that in order to really focus on equitable systems, we need to engage in vigilant self-awareness and ongoing self-awareness. So Nadine, I want to thank you for being really vulnerable and sharing your journey of self-awareness, because that's what it comes down to, and that's where we need to start. We need to identify where are our biases. And I want to start with an activity that I am borrowing from Dr. Nicole Holland Sims. And I'm sharing this because for me, it had a profound impact. And I'm almost embarrassed to admit this, but I was a social studies teacher for 10 years and I taught world history. And when I did this activity, I became really aware of biases that I didn't even realize I had or felt like I should have known better. So I'm going to ask you to put yourself in this situation. Suppose you were on a boat with your mother, your spouse, and your child. Suddenly, the boat begins to sink. You determine that you can only save one of the other passengers. Whom do you save? So I'm going to ask you to think about that, and in the chat, share out who it is that you would save. child, 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 child. Yeah, lots of children. Your mom. Save them both and sacrifice myself. Give you another 30 seconds or so. Yep. Child. Yeah, so I'm seeing a lot of children, some mother, some they would sacrifice themselves so that other people can survive. So oftentimes this is what happens in Western cultures. We identify that we would save our child first. And I'll be really honest, the first time I did this activity, I said, I'm saving my child. This is what else, what other option is there? And that's a very Western paradigm. That's a very Western lens. But if you were to ask somebody from an Eastern culture or an Eastern philosophy, they may say their mother, because you are able to find another spouse, you are able to have another child, but you only get one mother. And I was embarrassed that I didn't think about this. And I was embarrassed when I did this because I was so adamant that it would be that I would save my child. And how could it be any other way? And as a history teacher, I know all about filial piety and I know about the reverence and respect for parents in Eastern philosophy. But in my mind, it was only the child. And that's just an example of our own implicit biases, and we all have them, and it doesn't mean that we're bad, it doesn't mean that we're wrong, we just have these biases, these associations that we make. I want to share with you a video, and the video that I'm sharing comes from New York Times. They put together a fantastic series called Who Me Biased, and they are a series of small videos anywhere from 3 to 4 minutes long that unpack these ideas of implicit bias and steps that we can take to overcome that bias. I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen for a second because when I reshared my screen, I'm not sure that I optimized it for sound. So just give me a moment here as I reshare that. And where are we here? Why does this happen to me? There we go. All right, so I'm going to ask you to watch this video, and I don't think I shared my screen here again. Sorry, there we go. We're good to go. Okay, so I'm going to ask you as you're watching to think about what part of the video stands out to you. How does this align with what you already knew or understood about implicit bias? And what did you see from a new perspective? Also, if you have time, I would encourage you just to do a Google check and say Who Me Bias New York Times, and their videos are fantastic. So this is the introduction video that introduces implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream.
Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes the shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times, when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racist.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there's an over-representation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race and exploring ways we might combat the problem. One more thing, if you're seeing this and thinking that it doesn't apply to you, well, you might be falling prey to the blind spot bias. That's the scientific name for a mental bias that allows you to see biases in others, but not in yourself. We're biased.
Okay. I'll invite you in the chat to add any thoughts, comments, things that resonated with you, questions that you might have. I think it's important as we're starting this work, some of us have already engaged in this, but to recognize that we all see the world a certain way. We all have these biases. What we need to start doing is thinking about how can we kind of put those biases to the side? How can we challenge them? How can we recognize when we're seeing the world through a bias? And as we start to recognize that and say, okay, this is just an example of my bias coming through, we can then begin to see things from a different lens. So I'll invite you, if there's anything in the chat or anything that resonated with you, to share that in the chat, questions, comments.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
2000.
Sorry about that.
Tony, there's a request to share the link to that video in the chat.
Sure, I'll grab that for you right now. I'll actually share the link to the entire series. So this is the Who Me Biased series, and you can see, so this was the introduction video that we watched here. It is completely free, but as you scroll down, you can see that these are the other videos in the series. I really like them. So check our bias to wreck our bias. This picks up on what I was talking about earlier, that, you know, when we build in those intentional pausing points to think about our bias and to recognize when we're seeing the world through a bias, they give you some strategies for doing that. They talk about the importance of making connections with people who are different from us. That whole idea of people are hard to hate up close, so let's lean in. And they talk about the science behind building strong relationships with others. So they have lots of different videos, but I'll put that link in the chat for you. I'm just taking a look. Yeah, thank you all to everyone who has shared out. Thank you for sharing. The link to the Who Me Bias is in the chat for you to take a look at. Again, they're really short videos that just kind of bring to light some of those deeper issues that come along with having that implicit bias. All right, so that's self-awareness. The next thing we need to do is start to recognize some of the inequities within our systems. And I want to talk a little bit about this idea of disproportionality, because I feel like it's come up in quite a bit of conversations. I know school districts are being identified as having disproportionality within their systems. So what exactly does that mean? Disproportionality is incredibly complex, and it can be experienced in various forms. And when we're talking about disproportionality, we're really talking about an overrepresentation of a specific group, perhaps in special education programs or perhaps in disciplinary outcomes. So are we seeing a high number of a particular subgroup of students being identified for special education? Are we seeing a high number of students, particular students, being disciplined? So for instance, school systems might be disproportionate if they have, let's say, 20% of their population are Latinx students, but yet, 50% of the discipline referrals or 50% of their ISS or out of school suspensions are that of Latinx students. So that's an example of disproportionality. So it's either an overrepresentation or an underrepresentation of a particular group in a setting or scenario. So let's take a look at what this looks like in Pennsylvania. Overall, 33% of our students in Pennsylvania are non-white. We see our students who receive free and reduced lunch, we see our graduation rate. But let's talk about opportunity and discipline. So if 33% of our students are non-white, we see it 2.3 times more likely that a white, let me backtrack here. White students are 2.3 times more likely to be in an AP class compared with their Black students. So this is an example of disproportionality. So what this means is that Black students and students of color are not having access to rigorous honors and AP courses. And when we talked about what do equitable schools look like, sound like, and feel like, one of the words that came up was rigorous. And so what is actually being shown and what research what some research is being shown is that we hold Black and students of color to lower expectations when they come into our classrooms. So realistically, if 10% of our student body is Black and 15% of our student body is Latinx, we should see about that same rate in our honors and AP classes. But unfortunately, we see in our data that that is not happening. And this is from data in 2020. And actually, is Dr. Malone in on our call today? Am I correct in that? Maybe not. Okay. Discipline. So what does this mean? Black students are 5.6 times more likely to be suspended compared with their white peers. And what does this mean? We know that suspension has a profound impact on graduation rates, on student success rates. So if students are disciplined, if they're being removed from the classroom environment, we know then that they're missing out on valuable learning time. If they're missing out on valuable learning time, they're going to have gaps in their learning. Those gaps are compounded, and then they're less likely to graduate on time or at all, which then we know students who don't graduate from high school have fewer opportunities, are underemployed or unemployed when they graduate high school, are more likely to turn to crime. And then we see this school to prison pipeline kind of unfolding here. So this is a huge issue, not just for our schools, but also beyond. And when we talk about, underemployment and unemployment, some of this stems from our inequities within our school systems. So again, this is just a small snapshot of disproportionality in Pennsylvania, but I think it's really important that we are aware of this disproportionality as it exists. And this ties into both our self-awareness, but also our system awareness. So what do we do? How do we respond to this? I want to go back to our norms because I think it's really important, because there is no one size fits all approach to this. So earlier we talked about these 4 agreements of a courageous conversation, and I want to call out numbers 2 and number 4 here. So we know that this work is complex. We know that it is difficult. We know that it is not easy, right? And there is no one path that we can take. So it's going to be uncomfortable as we have those conversations, as we uncover that disproportionality and those biases that exist within our systems. But I really want to call out number 4 here. This is not a checkbox. This is not okay, we did an equity audit and we looked at these tools and resources. Okay, we are equitable. These are conversations. These are things that happen over time. And we need to know that just because we have these resources at our fingertips, it doesn't mean that we're going to create these equitable systems overnight.
Tony,
So let's go down. Yep.
this is just your 15-minute warning.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. So what can we do? How can we respond to this bias? I want to take this. This comes from Learning for Justice, which used to be Teaching Tolerance, which, holy cow, can I just say I'm so excited that they changed their name, because for me, it was baffling that we were in 2021 and they were still calling themselves Teaching Tolerance, which tolerance is really the bare minimum of what we're really looking for. So this past January, I believe it was, Teaching Tolerance changed their name to Learning for Justice. And they have 4 steps to respond to bias. So if you are a classroom teacher, if you are engaging in equity conversations with peers or with colleagues, these are 4 steps that you can take to respond to that bias. So we need to interrupt it. We need to question, we need to educate, redirect, and we need to echo. So I want to share with you a resource, and I'm going to put this in the chat for you. These are Speak Up pocket cards, and this is a resource that educators can take and print out, and they can take and put on their computers, or they can hang up in their classrooms or give out to students. And essentially what these are these tiny cards that have the 4 steps of interrupt, question, educate, and echo. And then on the back side is a description of what each of those looks like, but then also some sentence stems that you can use to engage in those 4 steps. So for instance, when we're talking about interrupting, try saying something like, I don't like that word or those words, or that phrase is hurtful. Or if you hear a joke that somebody thinks is funny, it's okay to say, I don't find that very funny. To question, ask, tell me more about that. What do you mean about that? Why are you saying that? To educate. So do you know the history of that word? Sometimes biased language is not coming from a place of hate. It's coming from a place of ignorance and just not knowing. And so do you know the history of that word, or do you know the history of that phrase and why we don't use that? It's okay to educate. And then finally, echo. Thanks for speaking up, Allison. I agree that that word is offensive and we shouldn't use it. So if someone speaks up against bias or hate, it's a good idea to echo, to support that person, and to mimic their phrases. So I love those cards because for me, when I'm in an uncomfortable conversation or an uncomfortable conversation, I like to have those stems right at my fingertips. It just makes it so much easier. These are some other sentence stems that I really like. Again, I've seen teachers have things like this posted around their room. I myself sometimes will have sentence stems taped to my computer because when you're uncomfortable and you're caught off guard, you want to make sure that you're prepared. For me, that makes me feel a little bit better. So seeking clarity, that whole tell me more about, let's explore that a little bit deeper. Offer an alternative perspective. So have you ever considered this? Speak your truth. I don't see it the way that you do. I see it as this. Try to find common ground. We don't agree on this, but perhaps we can agree on. If those sentence stems aren't working, it is okay to give yourself time and space. Sometimes a person will say something that is so egregious or catches you off guard that you're not quite sure how to respond. And it's okay to put some space between you and that person or you and that conversation. So saying, could we revisit this conversation about blank tomorrow is completely acceptable. Or set those boundaries and be okay with that. Please do not say whatever it is around me again, and just kind of be very clear. I think having these stems are just really powerful. And I promise you, it feels uncomfortable at the beginning, but the more that you say them and the more that you integrate them into your conversation, the easier it is to have those conversations. I know at the beginning, as I started to have these conversations with my peers, with my friends, with my family members, it was really uncomfortable. But once they became embedded in part of my vernacular, it was so much easier. And I felt more confident and prepared in having some of those conversations. The next thing I want to direct you to is the critical help framework. And this is great for educators and education systems that are beginning to or continuing their equity work. The critical help framework comes from Dr. Ronald Whitaker, who is a professor at Cabrini University. And he developed this framework to guide this equity work. And so the H stands for history. It's important that we understand the history of the students that are in our classroom, of the diverse backgrounds. When we look at the Asian American and the Pacific American hate that we're seeing right now in our country, it's understand that we understand the history. It's important that we understand the history and the background of those learners. The other piece is understanding the concepts of equality versus equity. So we unpacked some of that earlier. Equality is everybody getting the same thing, and equity is everybody getting what they need to be successful. The third, the L in that framework, is love. So how do we connect with all of our learners? How do we build those relationships? How do we build those connections? And so in online spaces, it's really challenging to do that. I can speak from my own experiences that as I deliver online professional learning and as I collaborate with districts, it's hard to build those relationships with the people behind a screen. And so we have to be really intentional if we're working in solely online spaces to build those connections. So how do we get to know our learners at a deeper level? How do we get to see them and celebrate them for who they are? And then finally, the P is looking at our programs, practices, and pedagogy and making sure that we're looking at them through an equitable lens. I'm going to share the link to the Critical Help Framework in our chat. This is a series of videos that were put together by the Montgomery County Intermediate Unit, and the Critical Help Framework has videos and resources to help support this work in your districts. And finally, I want to turn to the PDE Equitable Practices Hub. This is a fantastic resource to help guide districts in their equitable work. So I want to show you how to use this hub and what it looks like, because there are lots of resources in here. So in a few minutes, I just want to share these with you. So when you come to the Equitable Practices Hub, the first thing that you're going to see are the general pillars. So this hub is organized in two ways. First, on your pillars, and this is kind of the foundation of the equity work. So we see our general practices, our general equity practices pillar. We see our self-awareness pillar, data practices, family community engagement, academic equity, and disciplinary equity. So these are the pillars on which the hub is founded. Beneath that, then we have the spheres. So the spheres are kind of the people or the groups who would engage with those pillars. So we see our districts in school, we see our classroom, and we see our individual spheres. So those are outlined. As you scroll down, you'll also see that there is a Mid-Atlantic Equity Consortium equity audit. There are lots of equity audits out there. The Mid-Atlantic Equity Consortium has a fantastic equity tool. And what's really nice about this one is that there is a companion planning document that goes along with it. And the planning document acts sort of as a crosswalk between the equity audit and the PDE Equitable Hub. So I'm going to click on the planning guide just to show you what that looks like. If you are interested in doing an equity audit, it's recommended that you do it as a team with a team of teachers and teacher leaders and building and district leaders, and that you do it in its entirety, not just in a section that you think you need to focus on. After doing the equity audit, you're going to identify then areas of need and areas of strength. And what you'll see then is that it is paired, the planning document is paired with the pillars outlined in the Equitable Practices Tool Hub. So we could see here equity audit, the school policy, the school organization and administration, school climate. And as you scroll down, we see it partnered then with those pillars, and you have your areas for determining your priorities. So this is a great resource, and that's a great place to start if you're trying to identify where do we begin this work within our districts. From there, we see then each of the pillars outlined. And when we click on those pillars, we're going to see those spheres. So if you are a school or district leader, you'll probably want to click here. So I went into the general equity practices. If you are a classroom teacher, and what does this look like at the classroom level? And then what does this look like at the individual level? When you click on that square, you'll see then that it has lots of resources listed to help guide this work. And this is continuously updated several times a year to reflect new resources and new practices to help support this work. I'm going to share a link to our toolkit in the chat for you. Before we wrap up today, because I believe we have about 5 minutes remaining, I'm going to ask you to think about these 3 questions. What, so what, and now what? So in the chat, what is your what from today? What is a big takeaway, an aha that you had? And why is that important? So the so what, why is that aha or takeaway important? And then what is your next steps? What is your now what? What are you going to do with this information? And if you don't know, that's okay. You know, that's part of the lack of closure. Even if it's just, I'm going to look at the resources or I'm going to reflect on this, that's okay. We don't need or expect a grand plan from this, but just to become aware. So in the chat, if you could share your what, your big takeaway, your so what, why is that important? And then your now what are your next steps?